Hello, welcome back to Fireside Fairytales with myself, Rory. I am a writer with Varietal Literature, which is a writers' commune in Vancouver, Canada. And what we do here on Tuesday night is we read old fairy tales and folk tales and so on, just because I like them, to be completely honest. As always, if chat could let me know if the sound is coming through and nothing is too dominating or anything like that before we get started, that'd be good. So what are we reading tonight? We're reading a translation from the poet Skaldin, who obviously is Nordic. I think that name kind of gives it away. Oh, good. Hello, Suki, and hello, GS. Yes, it was quite the photo, wasn't it? So I'll give a little bit of context and background. We're going to be reading a folktale from Norse, probably, best known for Vikings, I guess, but Norse culture is a bit more than just Vikings. This is specifically a story of Thor and Loki journeying to the land of the giants. Now, I know a bit more about Norse mythology because, of the many things I don't know about my heritage, there is one thing I do know, and that is I am definitely Nordic and Scottish. But if not through genetics, which has been confirmed though, then through just appearance and height. I am 6'5", if you don't know that. Blue-eyed, blonde, tall, and if you look up pictures of Swedish men, it's a bunch of photocopies of my face. So there's definitely evidence of that. Also, just as an interesting trait, long before I knew much about any of that, I was obsessed with climbing mountains as a kid and going out on boats, and I really liked, epic tales and poetry and Tolkien and things like that. And, I'd like to think that there is some kind of echo on a genetic level with ancestors there, even though I'm sure that's probably not how it works. So just a little bit on the metaphysics of this world, because unlike stories we've read in the past, which are basically built in a Christian conception of the world, this is a pagan conception of the world, and a very specific one at that. So this is a super rudimentary version of it, but it will matter a little bit here. There are realms connected to a big tree, and only certain beings can travel through that tree to the other realms. Obviously, the gods which come from the realm called the Asir, like Thor and Loki, are able to do that. And they are traveling through the lands, if you will, the different realms, until they eventually get over to the land of the giants, which is a fundamentally different world. The world and realm that we would live in, that we would understand, is called, of course, Midgard. If you've watched any of the Marvel movies, you probably heard that. Midgard is just Earth. This only momentarily has some scenes in Midgard, and then it carries on into stories about going to the land of the giants, which has a name that I'm blanking on at the moment, so chat is welcome to add it if they want. I just wanted to add a little bit of that because, I think it will help a little bit with understanding it. There's one other caveat here. We are reading a translation of basically an epic poem by Skaldin. And if you've never read translations of very old epic poems and stuff like that, they don't really follow a lot of the narrative rules and established norms we would expect now. So we'd been reading fairy tales that were indeed old song tales, translated, but they had been changed into a format more understandable to a modern audience. So a couple of things we need to be prepared for. Standard morality doesn't really apply. There is some of it, but there is an overarching kind of like power is a big deal here. Fireplace is a tad louder than me. Okay, fireplace can come down. There is a sort of a fixation on powerful figures. So it is important to Thor and Loki and so on to establish their power, because that could mean survival or not in a lot of things, and it's about respect. And a couple of other things, they are gods. Anytime they show anything amounting to mercy, that's a great act that, is meant to show why they should be respected. I think those two things will be important as we go through this. The final thing is there will be hard cuts and breaks in the story. The story is connected. It breaks into basically 3 seemingly separate tales that come together in the end. So if you feel like, did I forget something or did I miss something? Probably not. It's just a format of writing you're probably unfamiliar with. So that's just to give you a little bit of context so you don't get too lost. Overall, I think it's not too hard to follow. And who doesn't want to know a little bit about the source material that, motivated things like the Marvel films? Oh, one more thing. The Marvel films have a lot of accuracy, to be honest, about who Thor and Loki are. But I want to add something here. Loki is probably the most changed in the Marvel films to be more of a contrast to Thor. Loki is a lot more Thor-like in the original tellings, though I will say it varies a lot because these are technically oral traditions where they got changed a lot and we only have a few writings. So that's the most I'll say. This is Thor and Loki's journey to the land of the giants. Many seasons ago, Thor and Loki were traveling together on Thor's chariot pulled by his 2 goats. When the sun began to set, they came to the house of a farmer. The farmer welcomed Thor and Loki inside to stay for the night. Because the family were just simple farmers, they did not have much food to share with their 2 hungry guests. So, Thor slaughtered his 2 goats, chopped up their meat, and put it into a cooking pot. When the meat was cooked, Thor and Loki sat down to enjoy their evening meal. Thor invited the farmer, his wife, and their 2 children, Thjolvi and Hroskva, to join them. Thor spread out the goat skin next to the table, then told the farmer and his family to throw the bones onto the goat skin. Thor and Loki stayed at the farmer's house for the night, and before dawn, Thor got up and put on his clothes. He reached for his hammer Mjolnir, and began to swing it over the 2 goat skins with the bones on it. The bones began dancing on the floor. They started to form the shape of 2 goats. The goatskin then wrapped itself around the shapes, bringing the 2 goats back to life. But something was wrong. One of the goats was limping. Thor sat down on one knee to feel the leg of the goat. He could clearly feel it was broken. Thor became furious in an instant and yelled at the farmer and his family to come outside. When the family came outside, Thor demanded to know who had broken one of the bones. Loki, who was stood in the entrance to the house, smiled toward the boy. The family was frozen with fear. They watched Thor as he held his hammer. Mjolnir, while sparks were flying left and right throughout the air. If a stare from fierce eyes could kill, the family would have died immediately. Well, who did it? Thor asked slowly. He eyed each member of the family carefully before moving his glare to the next. The boy, Thjalfi, said, almost whispering, "It was me, mighty Thor." The farmer then fell to his knees and pleaded, "Thor, please do not harm my family. You can have everything I own." Dark clouds started to drift apart in the sky. Slowly, the bird songs began carrying through the air again. Thor's anger had passed. Thor then said in a calm voice, "I will take both your children, Thjalfi and Hroskva, in compensation. They will become my servants." Thor told the farmer to take care of his 2 goats and left the farm with Loki and the 2 children. Some of the translation here is a little strange, so I'm trying to adjust it. The children and Thor traveled east to the ocean, then crossed over it. After many days on the sea, they finally saw land, and here they went ashore. So, just as a note here, it isn't always clear, because, world building's a little bit sloppy in traditional myth. But it would seem that he has traveled from Midgard to the land of the giants, which I think is Jotunheim, but I could be wrong. After many days on sea, they finally saw land, and here they went ashore. Next to the beach was a huge forest with trees as tall as mounts and as wide as a house. Thor said, "Let's go into the forest." They hiked for hours through the forest. When it began to get dark, as luck would have it, they found a massive hall standing alone in the forest. It was a bit strange, because one end of the hall had an opening as wide as the hall itself. But because of their long trip, they did not think much about it and slept for the night in the middle of the hall. During the night, they were awoken when the ground began to shake under them. Thor and his companions scrambled for a more secure room in the hall and found one further down and to the right. Thor stood at the entrance to the room with Mjolnir ready in his hand. Thjalfi and Hroskva stood inside the smaller room with Loki, too scared to look out into the hall. The ground stopped shaking a few moments later, but then a loud, rumbling noise filled the air for the rest of the night. At sunrise, Thor went outside. He found a giant sleeping in the forest a short distance away from the hall. The giant snored heavily as he slept, and then Thor understood the noise that he had heard that night. Thor put on his belt of strength, and he began to be filled with mighty power. But the giant woke up, then quickly stood before Thor was ready. It is said that for once Thor was too startled to strike with his hammer. Instead, he asked the giant for his name, and the giant replied, "I am Skrymir, and I do not need to ask your name, because I know who you are, Thor. You belong to the Aesir. But Thor, who are you? What are you doing here in Giant Land? And why have you dragged my glove away?" Skrymir then reached down and picked up his glove. Thor now saw that during the night he had mistaken this glove for a hall. Skrymir shook his glove, and Loki and the 2 children landed on the grass next to him. Skrymir then sat down and began to eat his breakfast. Thor and his companions decided to join him. Skrymir asked Thor, "So, where are you going?" Thor answered, "We are going east." Skrymir said, "So am I. We should pull our provisions together." Thor nodded in agreement. When they were done eating, Skrymir put all their provisions together in one bag and threw it over his shoulder. "Because I take much larger steps than you, it will probably be nighttime before you see me again," said Skrymir. In the evening, Thor, Loki, Thjalfi, and Hroskva caught up with Skrymir again under a huge oak tree. Skrymir gave Thor the food bag and said he wanted to lie down and go to sleep. Moments later, Skrymir fell asleep and again snored loudly. Thor sat down next to the food bag and began to untie the knots, but no matter how hard he tried, he could simply not loosen any of the knots. Thor became angry when he realized his efforts were for nothing. Thor stood up and went over to Skrymir, who was still asleep, and struck Skrymir on the head with Mjolnir in both his hands. But to his surprise, Skrymir awoke and asked, "Did a leaf from the tree just fall down on my head? Oh, and Thor, did you enjoy your evening meal? And are you getting ready to go to sleep?" Thor replied, "Yes, we are getting ready to go to sleep." Skrymir went back to sleep and started snoring loudly again. In the middle of the night, after many hours of trying to fall asleep, Thor just could not take it anymore. He stood and walked over to Skrymir with his hammer in his hand. Thor raised his hammer and hit Skrymir with a hard blow on his head. Thor felt the hammer sink deep into his skull. Skrymir awoke yet again and said, "What now? Did an acorn just fall down from the tree and hit me on my head? And what are you doing standing there in the middle of the night?" Thor quickly moved a few steps back and said, "I just woke up. Yes, it is still night, Skrymir. I will try and go back to sleep." Thor thought to himself, "If I can just hit him a third time, I will make sure it will be the last I see this giant." Thor laid down and waited for Skrymir to fall asleep. A little before dawn, Skrymir had fallen asleep again. Thor stood up and ran towards Skrymir with his hammer raised, and with all his might he struck Skrymir on the temple. The hammer sank up to its shaft into Skrymir's head. The strike caused Skrymir to sit up, brush the side of his head, and ask, "Are there some birds sitting in the tree above me? I think I just got hit in the head with some leaves or twigs from the branches. Are you awake, Thor? It is time to get up and get dressed." Thor and Loki arrive at Utgard, which is a realm of giants. "We are almost at the stronghold called Utgard. I have heard you whispering among yourself that I am not a small man, but if I go to Utgard, you will see much larger men than me. But you should know, Thor, they do not like people who act arrogantly, especially from such a small fry like you. Or else I would suggest that you turn back, and in my opinion, that would be the best thing for you to do. But if you really want to go to Utgard, then continue to head east. My path leads me northward to those mountains that you can see over there." Skrymir then picked up the food bag, threw it over his shoulder, and headed north into the forest. Thor and his companions continued on their journey and traveled east until midday when they arrived at a plain where they saw a huge fortress. It was so tall they had to bend their necks all the way back just to see the top of it. There's a bit of a picture. They walked up to the fortress, but could not enter because the gate was closed. Thor went up to the gate and tried to open it with all his might, but he could not budge it. So Thor and his companions squeezed themselves in between the bars in the gate. When they came inside, they found themselves in a huge hall with many giants, who all sat eating and drinking. Some of them were so large, even 2 benches could not hold them. Pardon me. They went up to greet the king, called Utgard Loki. The king sat and looked at them for a few moments and said, actually, before I say this, Utgard Loki. Loki was not a terribly uncommon name, so that's why it's Utgard Loki, not the Loki he's traveling with. News travels slowly from distant parts, but I am wrong in thinking that this little fellow with the red hair is Thor? Surely there is more to you than meets the eye. Tell me, travelers, what skills do you think that you are capable of competing?
No one is allowed to stay here unless they have some skill or knowledge greater than other men.
Loki, who was standing in the back of the group, said,
I have a skill that is ready to be tested because I can eat faster than any man in this hull.
Utgard Loki answered,
Well, that would be quite an accomplishment. Since you are so eager to get tested, we shall do that.
The king stood up and called for a man named Logi. Not Loki, Logi. And told him to come forward for an eating contest with Loki. A large trough filled with meat was brought into the hall and placed on the floor. Loki placed himself at one end and Logi at the other. They both began to eat as fast as they could, and when they met in the middle of the trough, Loki had eaten all the meat from the bones, but Logi had only eaten the meat, but also had not only eaten the meat, but also the bones and even the trough. It was clear to everyone that Loki had lost the contest. You can get a sense of the size here. Down in the bottom of this picture is a Thor, who's already kind of large, and Loki. Then Utgard Loki looked at the little boy Thjolfi.
So, in what can you compete?
Thjolfi replied, I can run faster than anyone in this hall.
Utgard Loki replied, This is indeed a fine sport, little boy, but you will have to be quick if you want to win.
Utgard Loki stood up and said,
Let's go outside to the flat plains of Jotunheim. Hugi, come here, you will race this little boy.
In the first race, Hugi was so quick that he turned around while still running, to look at Thjolfi. Then Utgard Loki said,
Thjolfi, you are not even trying. You have to better if you want to win. But it does seem that you are faster than your travel companions.
Then they began a race for a second time. By the time Loki was at the end of the track, Thjolfi was still a longbow shot away. Then Utgard Loki said,
I think you know how to run a good race, Thjolfi, but I don't think you can win. Let's try it for a third time.
In the third race, when Loki had reached the end of the track, Thjolfi was not even halfway.
Then Utgard Loki said, The contest is over, you lost, little boy, and walked inside.
After a short break, Utgard Loki looked at Thor and said,
What skills do you want to show us, Thor? I have heard so many tales about you. Are there any truth in them?
Thor answered,
If you want to test me, you can test me in drinking, because I am thirsty.
Utgard Loki replied,
Well, that can be easily arranged.
He called to his cupbearer to bring in the feasting horn from which the retainers usually drank. The cupbearer quickly brought in the horn and placed it in Thor's hand.
Then Utgard Loki said, Anyone who can empty this horn in one drink is considered a good drinker. Some drain it in 2, but I have never seen anyone who needs more than 3.
Thor looked at the horn, and it did not seem to be very large, although it was rather long. But he was quite thirsty, so he began to drink. And he drank as much as he could, and then stopped to look inside the horn. It seemed that the amount in the horn was only slightly lower than it had been before.
Utgard Loki said, Good drinking, Thor, although not that much. I would not have believed it if I had been told that Thor of the Aesir would have drunk more, but I know that you will finish it in a second drink.
Thor said nothing and put the horn to his mouth and was determined to take a larger drink. While drinking, he noticed that he could not lift the horn up from the floor as much as he would have liked. And he drank as much as he could, and as long as he could hold his breath. He then lowered the horn from his mouth and looked inside. It seemed to him that the level had gone down even less than it had before. But now there was enough space at the top of the horn to carry without spilling it. Utgard Loki asked,
"What now, Thor? Are you going to be so brave that you will take one sip more than is good for you? It seems to me that if you want to take a third drink from the horn, then it will have to be the biggest. But among us here you will not be known as a great man, as you are among the Aesir, unless you can do better in these contests."
Thor began to get angry and placed the horn to his mouth for the third time and drank with all his might, continuing as long as he could. When he looked into the horn, he could at least see some difference. Then he gave the horn back and would not drink any more.
Utgard Loki said, "Clearly your strength is not as great as we thought. But do you want to be in another contest, because it is clear that you are not going to succeed here?"
Thor replied,
"I am ready for another contest. What sort of contest did you have in mind?"
Utgard Loki replied,
"We have a little game here, my boys and I. We like to see who can lift up my cat from the floor without any of its legs touching the ground. Do you think you can do that, Thor?"
A rather large gray cat walked into the hall, and Thor approached it, placing it his hand under the middle of the belly, and started to lift the cat up. You can sort of see him with the cat here. It's a little blurry, but he's down there under the cat. But no matter how much Thor raised his hand, the cat arched its back. When he had lifted the cat up from the floor as high as he could, one of the cat's paws was lifted off from the floor for a moment, striking fear into the nearby giants that saw it. Then Utgard Loki said, "All right, this contest has gone as I expected it would. The cat is rather large, whereas Thor is rather short and small compared with us large men here." Then Thor replied, "If you think I am so little, then why don't you have someone come forward and wrestle with me?" Thor getting more and more angry by the minute. Utgard Loki looked over at the benches and replied, "I don't see any man in here who I find dignified to wrestle with you. But wait!" And he whispered something to his guard next to him. The guard went into a nearby room, and moments later an old woman came into the hall.
"This is my nurse. Her name is Ellie. You can try to wrestle with her, and she has thrown men to the ground who seem just as strong as you."
Thor began to wrestle her, but the more he used his strength, the stronger and more steadfastly she was. Thor began to lose his footing and fell down to one knee while turning his face completely pale. There is Thor trying to fight an old lady. Utgard Loki stood up and said,
"All right, enough. You have clearly lost the contest. If you cannot even win against my old nurse Ellie, there is no reason for you to wrestle any other man in this hall."
Thor and his companions were then given a place to sit at one of the benches and were treated well for the rest of the night. In the morning, at first light, Thor and his companions stood up and dressed and prepared to leave. Utgard Loki then came in and had a table set for them, and they were treated to both food and drinks. When they had finished eating, they wanted to leave. Utgard Loki accompanied them as they left the fortress of Utgard. Before they left, Utgard Loki asked Thor how he thought the trip had been and whether Thor had ever met someone who were more powerful. Thor replied, "I have been seriously dishonored in this encounter, and now I know that you will, that I am a person of little strength." Utgard Loki answered, "Well, now that you are out of the fortress, I will tell you the truth, because as long as I am alive, you will not be allowed to enter again, and I can assure you that you would never be allowed to enter in the first place if I had known in advance that you had so much strength in you, because you nearly brought disaster upon us. I have tricked you with my magic, just as I did the first time I met you in the forest.
I am the one you met there called Screamia, and when you tried to untie the food bag, you were unable to find where to undo it because I had fastened it with iron wire. And when you struck me 3 times with your hammer, Mjolnir, the first blow you did was the least, yet it was so powerful that it would have killed me had it found its mark. But if you look over to those 3 flat-topped mountains, they do not have 3 square-shaped valleys below them, with one deeper than the others. These are the marks of your hammer. I moved them with my magic and placed them in front of your blows, so that you did not see me, but you did not see me doing it. And I did the same thing last night. I used my magic trick to trick you and your companions. When Loki had his eating contest against Loki, it was not a normal man, it was a fire in the shape of a man, and that is why it consumed both the bones and the wood. When Thjolfi ran against the one called Hugi, that was my mind, and Thjolfi could not be expected to compete with the speed of my thoughts. And Thor, when you drank from the horn and thought you were very slow in draining it, it was no less than a miracle. I would never have believed it if I did not see it with my own eyes. The other end of the horn, which you could not lift up from the floor, was out in the ocean, and when you come to the ocean, you will see how much your drinking lowered it. Utgard Loki continued to speak. And when you lifted up one of the cat's paws from the floor, it was not just a cat, it was the Midgard serpent, but you raised him so high that he could almost reach the sky. I'll tell you about the serpent in a minute. It was a real wonder that you remained on your feet for so long during the wrestling, and you only fell to one of your knees as you struggled with Ellie. Ellie means old age, and no one overcomes old age. But before you go, Thor, it would be best for both of us if you never come back here again to meet me. Next time I will defend my stronghold with similar magic. When Utgard Loki was done speaking, Thor gripped his hammer and raised it into the air, but when he was ready to strike, Utgard Loki was nowhere to be seen. The stronghold had also disappeared, and there was just one big beautiful plain in Jotunheim. And there you go. That's the story of Thor and Loki going to the land of the giants. Now, just to clarify one more time, Utgard Loki was not the Asir Loki that he was traveling with. Now, as far as how these distinctions work, I'm not going to get into it because they're confusing and not settled. Because again, they are basically, there was a bunch of different tribes that had connections through trade and war and whatever else that had similar gods and similar stories, but they got told differently and passed on differently. And so the conception, like even how many realms are on the Tree of Life and all of that is debated. Some say 7, I think some say 9. It's not really settled because it kind of depended on where you lived and who you heard the stories from. Oh, chat was busy for this one. Where do I start? Holly says, are they in the human world or in the gods world when they begin? Given that the farmer is just a farmer and not given any special status, I would imagine they're in Midgard. It's possible that they're in the land of the giants at the beginning, but I don't know. My conception, based on what I know, is that they start in Midgard, they travel, they cross the sea. You see, this is where it gets weird, because the sea is Jotunheim is a different realm. But in some tellings, it's still like a place you can get to. If you travel long enough, but in other tellings, like you have to be able to travel through the Tree of Life, so I honestly don't know. I don't know how much matters, but the conception that I'm going with is that trip over the sea was essentially Thor and Loki traveling through the Tree of Life to the realm of Jotunheim. But they definitely don't start in the Valley of the Giants, because when they land on the shore, the first thing they note is the trees are huge here. So everything's bigger. The cats are bigger. Everything's bigger.
Holly says, it's so weird that I just so happened to have read this exact story 2 days ago. Yeah, it's kind of circled the internet. That's how I found it, because I've looked for story versions of these myths. You can find descriptions of them, but they're always like very textbook. Like, they're like, then Thor, goes through 3 challenges. It's not written like a story like you would tell it. And what I liked about this, it came from some kind of shady pop-up website covered in ads called like Norse Culture or something. But it didn't give me the source of the translation. So if this is a copyrighted translation, someone's going to have to let me know. It just said it was adapted from Skalden, who is definitely in the public domain. Holly says, I wonder if the 2 goats ever get resentful about being repeatedly being eaten and resurrected. I don't know if it's implied that it's done repeatedly. Because he's traveling with these 2 goats, and it's because the farmers don't have food that he takes them apart, but they still carry provisions. So I don't think that's like his provisions. I think it was like he was using some Mjolnir magic. It's very clear that Thor doesn't have magic, but Mjolnir does. Why would he tell him that? Oh, okay. So this was sort of something I wanted to point out here. That I hinted to in the beginning, about this notion of like, you can't, of power, right? So he comes to this land and he is challenged and he fails the challenges, and you notice that Thor accepts those failures, right? Like, if he is not strong enough to meet the standards of the house he's in, he takes that with a certain amount of shame and he leaves. He doesn't get petty. So there is this sense of honor in it. However, keep in mind that this is written by a poet who is ultimately trying to tell a story about the great acts of Thor, right? Like, this is very clearly about Thor being a great figure. So the character has to reveal in the end that Thor isn't actually weaker than the giants, because as you probably do know, because it's made its way into lots of pop culture, Thor and the other gods killed giants to establish sort of peace in Midgard, frost giants specifically. So if it looks like he's can't challenge an old woman, then when you're thinking about Ragnarok, the end of all of this, where they fight the giants again, and I think at that point the giants win for a bit. But if you're, gambling on the Aesir gods the way they were, you got to believe he's powerful. So I think the point here, I'm going to pull a little bit of Nietzsche on this, is that the Aesir gods are unquestionably more powerful than everything, right? That's why they're superior. The only way that you can win against them is with deception. And that is a really common theme, actually, in a lot of old tales, that this sort of might is absolute with these higher beings, but they can be deceived and manipulated. And so he has to reveal it, because otherwise Thor looks like a fool. You'll notice that Loki, or the Loki doesn't really have much of a role here. And that is a good example of old writing. It's not even clear why Loki is here other than to partake in one of the contests. And you might think he'd be the trickster, but he wasn't the trickster. Utgard Loki was. I don't know how it relates to the fact that Loki is actually descended from giants in most tellings, so I don't know how that relates here. But I enjoyed the story. It is long, but as you can see, it's connected. Although, I guess you could leave off the beginning. The beginning just establishes why Thjolfi and Hroskva are with him. And Thjolfi is the one that runs. Hroskva doesn't do anything in that story. I particularly like that the glove was the hull. I thought that was cool. Anyways, if you didn't catch it last week on Thursday, Felix and I went through some writing challenges that I do about describing the ocean. But we also had our first edition of fan art of Randolph, the brother of Gandalf, the emo brother of Gandalf. So if you want to see that, it's in the beginning of the episode last week. I still haven't put up part 4 of my story, and that's on me at this point. So that's actually what I'm going to go and work on after this. But that will be up this week. And as per usual, I will see you guys on Thursday. So thanks so much for tuning in, chat, and for listening to me. I certainly hope you enjoyed that tale. I will say I have a bit of a different relationship to these ones because, you know, I can kind of feel that Nordic blood. And I don't know how else to put it other than I've never felt very confused by the oddities of these stories the way I am in other fairy tales that I don't understand. So I really enjoy reading these. If you know a source of sort of narrative style tellings of classic poems, I mean, a lot of them are from Skeldin, to be honest, but there's others like Var, I'm not even going to try, but it's Var something, is another famous epic poet. But if you know some sources of people who let the sort of narrative hold true rather than sort of intellectual retellings, I'd be happy to read them. And beyond that, get a good sleep, folks, and I will see you on Thursday.